Welcome to the second to last session of the summer school. That means the 39th session of the summer school on understanding LLM understanding. Our speaker now is Aishwarya Agrawal, an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Operations Research at University of Montreal. She's also a Canada SciFar AI chair and a core academic member of MILA, the Quebec AI Institute. She also spends one day a week at Google DeepMind as a research scientist. Aishwarya, pronounce your name so tell me how I mispronounced it.
It's very close, Aishwarya.
Aishwarya, what that was, I didn't do too well. So her interests lie at the intersection of computer vision, deep learning, and natural language processing, with the goal of developing artificial intelligence systems that can, that is to say, understand the contents of an image, who, what, where, doing what, and talk, that is to say, communicate the understanding to humans in free form natural language. Let's say that was a good way of unpacking it. It wasn't as neutral as you could have said it, but it's understandable. And now I pass it over to Aishwarya.
Thank you, Stefan, for the introduction. So I will jump right into the talk. Right. So before I start my talk, I just wanted to say that these are all my students that I supervise at MILA and University of Montreal. And some of this stuff I'm going to be presenting today is work done by all these awesome students, and they also helped me prepare the slides. So literally, I'm just giving the talk here. The credit goes to them. So those of you who might not be that familiar with this, so my work is at the intersection of two disciplines, computer vision and natural language processing. And there is actually a community so-called of vision and language. So vision and language is sort of like a field in itself. And now we generally refer to these problems by the name of multimodal. But like 5 years back, the name used to be vision and language. So just to give you a sense of what kind of tasks we tackle in this field, I'm sure you are probably already familiar with all of these, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. So people have done a lot of research, and we have built systems for tasks like image captioning, where the system is given an image and the task is to describe that image in natural language, right? So the input is image, output is generated language. There is also this task for visual question answering, and this is something that I have worked quite a bit on. So here the task is given a question in natural language. So this is a free form open-ended question. An image to the model. The task for the AI system here is to answer the question, and the answer is expected to be precise and very brief. We also study this task called text to image retrieval, where basically the AI system is given a caption and a bunch of images, and it has to retrieve the image that best matches the description given in the caption. And we also have systems that can now generate images conditioned on text, right? So here the generation is actually from scratch, pixel by pixel. So these are some of the very popular tasks that we study in the field of vision and language, and we have all these cool models these days, Gemini, GPT-4, and all of these that can do some of these tasks, right? So did you say something, Steven?
Oh, we just changed the volume. Go ahead, please.
Okay, yeah. So before I tell you, the focus of my talk is actually going to be about, in spite of all the impressive progress that we see that has been made by these vision and language models, what are some outstanding challenges for the multimodal research community? But let me first motivate you a little bit about like why are these systems useful, and I like to think about this from an application point of view. So systems that can process multimodal inputs, particularly images and text, can be very useful for visually impaired users. So there is actually an app called VisVis, which lets visually impaired users take pictures of objects in their houses. So here is a picture taken by one of the visually impaired users, and then they can ask questions like what kind of wine is this and so on, right? So it can be immensely useful in such situations. It can also be useful for just querying a bunch of images. So for example, if you use like Google Photos or any other photo organizing library, you basically would like to, retrieve one particular image by just typing the query in natural language without having to browse through all the images, right? So it is just a very useful interface to retrieve images. And finally, we would want some sort of grounded virtual assistants, right? So we have these assistants like Siri, Alexa, and all of that, but they are not situated in the environment. They can only talk to us in natural language. They cannot see the world around us. So what if they also had the ability to see? Then we could basically ask them questions like, hey, did you see my keys? Did you see where I left my laptop charger? Right. So it just opens a lot of capabilities for these assistants to help us in our day-to-day lives. So now let's take a look at what does the state of the art look like in terms of vision and language understanding. And here what I'm showing you is an example output from a AI system called Flamingo, which was built by DeepMind few years ago. And now this has been superseded by systems like Gemini from Google DeepMind and GPT-4 from OpenAI and a bunch of other open source models as well. So here, I just want to give you a sense for like this model, how impressive it already is. So here we give the model a picture of a dog and it generates a caption. It says, this is a dog. It's a white fluffy dog. And then human can ask a question. What season is this? The model says it looks like a summer day. Why do you think so? Because the grass is green and the dog is not wearing a sweater. What breed is the dog? It's Samoyed. Is the dog running? No, it's sitting. Can you describe the pose of its back leg? Yes, the back legs are bent and the dog is sitting on its haunches. Right. So it's a pretty well-grounded conversation, and not only does the model understand recognize this dog in the image, it also recognizes that it's summer, and it also has some sort of common sense understanding that now it is summer probably because the dog is not wearing a sweater, right? So it's a pretty interesting output from the system, and you might feel like, wow, the system is great, and like vision and language is solved, models can process multimodal inputs. So what is left to do, right? And this is another example on the image generation front. Is an example from OpenAI's DALI 2 model, which basically can generate all these interesting compositions of concepts, right? So dolphin in an astronaut suit on a Saturn. It probably hasn't seen similar images of dolphin in an astronaut suit on Saturn, but it can decompose those concepts and generate these new compositions, right? So this is also pretty impressive. So what I want to focus on here, despite all these amazing advances made by like the vision and language models over like last decade or so, what are still some interesting research questions that are worth working on? And these, some of the, obviously there are many more challenges than what I'm going to talk about today, but I'm going to focus on 3 challenges, and I'm going to talk about some work we have done for each of these challenges. So the first challenge I want to talk about is visual linguistic compositional reasoning, and I will explain what I mean by that. The second challenge I want to talk about is evaluating the output of these systems, how challenging that can be. And the third challenge I'm going to talk about is evaluating whether these systems have cultural understanding, not just generic scene understanding, but do they understand the cultural concepts, and are they able to do that in a geo-diverse setting? So this is actually a project that we are working on, and we are submitting to a conference called DMNLP, whose deadline is tomorrow actually. So this is a very recent project. Okay, so what do we mean by visual linguistic compositional reasoning? So here, what you are seeing is an image and 2 captions, where caption 1 is the correct caption corresponding to this image, and caption 2 is the incorrect caption. But if you look at the difference between caption 1 and caption 2, the set of words is exactly the same. The only difference is in the ordering of the words, right? And on the image side, what it corresponds to is basically the positions of the dog and cat has been swapped, right? In one case, dog is on the left, and in the other case, the cat is on the left. So this kind of understanding, it's an example of a compositional understanding where the individual elements or the individual concepts are still the same. The dog is still the same, the cat is still the same, but their composition has been changed, right? So in this case, their spatial positioning, relative spatial positioning has been changed, and on the sentence side, the words have been the order of the words has been changed. So this is actually something that people have studied recently, and we have found that models are not very good at this kind of compositional understanding. So in this case, the task for the model is given these two captions, and given an image, it has to predict which caption is the right match, right? So it's a binary classification task, random chance is 50%. So you might be familiar with this model called CLIP, which is a multimodal model in that it consumes images, consumes language, and then tells you what is the similarity score or what is the matching score between a given image and a given caption. And this model has been used quite widely recently. It has shown like impressive image understanding capabilities, although on the language side, it's not clear how good its language understanding capabilities are. So if you basically give this task of binary classification, of like figuring out which caption is the correct one to this CLIP model, it actually fails quite badly. And so what might be the reason for why it is failing, right? So here what I'm going to present is basically some hypothesis on why it might be failing, and basically to take some steps to like tackle those problems or like the shortcomings of CLIP, and we'll see that now the same CLIP model now starts performing better on this task. So this CLIP model is actually, the way it is trained on pairs of image caption pairs, and the objective function when we train this model is basically we ask the model to maximize the similarity between the correct image caption match and minimize the similarity between incorrect image caption match. Now, in the process of doing that, it really depends on the incorrect image caption matches, how difficult those are. So basically, we have a positive image caption, and then we have a bunch of negative image captions, right? So in the pre-training data, it is natural to assume that the pre-training data for a CLIP model is actually very huge. It's internet scale data. So it probably hasn't seen enough examples of very controlled hard negatives, right? So this example, we saw dog on the left and cat on the right versus cat on the left and dog on the right. It's a very hard negative example. These captions are like they have the exact same set of words. The ordering is different. So hypothesis here is the pre-training data that CLIP is trained on is too coarse to learn such compositional relationship from. So in this paper, what we do, and this is something that other people have also explored, but our contribution mainly lies in the space of proposing new loss functions and better utilizing the hard negatives. So what we do here is basically for every caption that we have in our data set, we generate automatically a hard negative caption corresponding to that. So let's say we have the caption, a dog and a cat playing on the grass. We swap the word dog with the word bear. And now we get this negative. And this is actually a hard negative caption because with respect to the positive caption, only there's one word change, right? A bear and a cat playing on the grass. And notice that this caption is partially correct for this image because there is still a cat playing on the grass, although there is no bear. So the precise objective function that we fine tune, so we take this pre-trained CLIP model, we generate such hard negative captions with random word swapping, and then we train the model to align the positive caption with the image, and at the same time, partially align the hard negative caption with the image. And I'll explain in further slides like how exactly, what is the exact, like how exactly do we do partial alignment. And on top of this, another objective function we have is we also encourage the model to learn distinct representations for the positive caption and the negative caption. So you might basically think that the CLIP objective function might already be encouraging the model to learn distinct representations, but turns out it is not enough. That level of supervision is not enough. So having this even like finer grained supervision to encourage the model to have distinct representations, it helps the model. So in terms of generating hard negatives, we generate 4 different kinds of hard negatives. So we swap objects, we change the attributes of object, we change verbs, we change the object names themselves. So it actually corresponds to like relation edit, attribute edit, action edit, and object edit. And once we have these captions, we basically, this is sort of like data augmentation. So we have the same set of images, but now we have 4 times the number of captions, one original caption and 4 extra captions, for hard negative captions, right? And then what we do is essentially fine tune the model with some added loss functions. So this is, let's say this is the original clip loss, where basically I is your image, T is your text. You feed the image to image encoder, text through your text encoder. So it's basically a bunch stack of transformers. And then we get the image embedding and the text embedding, and we compute the similarity. And we essentially apply what is called contrastive loss, where we train the model to maximize the similarity for the right match and minimize the similarity for the incorrect match. Now, the additional losses we propose in this paper are essentially 2 types of losses. One is called intramodal loss, and the other one is called cross-modal loss. So in the intramodal loss, essentially what we are doing is we take the positive caption and each of those hard negative captions that I showed on the previous slide, and basically we ask the model to also minimize the similarity, maximize the distance between these captions. And the other loss we have is cross-modal rank loss, where basically now what we do is look at the gap in the similarity between positive image caption similarity, and hard negative caption and the same image. So similarity of the image with the positive caption, similarity of the image with the negative caption. And we basically, this is margin loss. So we say that there should be a minimum gap in these similarities. And this minimum gap, so this threshold or margin or whatever you want to call it, we actually make this adaptive in nature. So we don't hand code it, we don't have a fixed threshold value. We basically set this to the worst case similarity from the previous iteration of training. So, and the motivation for doing that is basically as the training progresses, the model should challenge itself. It should get better and better at doing the task. So actually this combination, so we have like a lot of details in the paper, and essentially we find that each of these losses is useful in in making the model better at compositional understanding. And here on the left, what you're seeing is this threshold. As I said, this threshold is adaptive in nature, and we have actually different thresholds for different types of hard negative caption. And we see that as time progresses, the threshold value increases. And actually, for the relation category, the threshold value increases by quite a bit. So that seems to be the category which is most difficult for the model to understand. And on the right side, what I'm showing you are the loss curves. So basically, as time progresses, CMR in blue is the cross-modal loss, which is basically has this margin in it, right? So what happens is in the initial steps of training, the model is not able to meet that threshold. So the loss increases, but as time progresses, it is able to, its capabilities improve, it is able to meet the threshold. So now the loss stabilizes after that, does not increase anymore after that. And the IMC loss, the green one, it is the intramodal loss. So we basically, the loss is higher if the gap is smaller between the positive and the hard negative. So basically, loss going down suggests that the model is increasing the gap between positive and hard negative captions, and the total loss is just a combination of these. So overall, this framework of generating hard negatives and having these, fine-grained losses to encourage the model to learn distinct representations between hard negative captions and original positive captions, it helps quite a bit when we evaluate this model on some compositional understanding benchmarks. So here we are comparing with CLIP, which is the base model, but also a strong baseline, which was the state of the art method at the point when we published the paper. And that they essentially, what they do in this neck clip paper, which is the state of the art at that time, is they just generate these hard negatives and train it with the standard clip loss. But what we show is if you train it with these additional losses, the performance actually, there is the potential of hard negatives is tapped even better. So overall, few like high level conclusions I want to make from this line of work is clip like models struggle with such kind of visual linguistic compositional reasoning. But automatically generating such hard negative captions and then fine-tuning models with them is a promising direction to improve the capabilities of such foundational models like CLIP. And particularly what we found in this work is explicitly encouraging disparity between the positive and hard negative representations with these specifically designed losses. It actually helps boost the performance even more. So one thing you need to be careful about is when you apply all these losses and fine tune a model like CLIP for improving its compositional understanding, you don't want to overdo it, because if you overdo it, it will start losing its foundational capabilities, which is, for example, let's say you evaluate it on some image classification task where it doesn't need this compositional understanding. The performance might go down, start going down, because now it starts overfitting to this compositional understanding task. So you have to maintain a sweet balance there, and we show in this paper that we don't take a lot of hit in that original performance. So so this was following up on this, where we generate caption based hard negatives. In a very recent project which we submitted to NeurIPS, we wondered, what if we generate image based hard negatives? Can we do that? And how would that look like in that, like how would that improve the model performance? So in this work, we actually what we do is we basically create this automated pipeline followed by human verification, where given an natural image, so here you are seeing 4 different images, and these images come from a data set called COCO, which is Common Objects in Context. It is a very famous data set in the computer vision community. It is known for its very challenging nature, consists of like a bunch of objects in their cluttered surroundings, right? So it is not very easy for models to process these, to parse these images. So in this work, what we do is we propose a way to take those images and generate hard negative counterparts of those images. And what we mean by hard negative in this case is essentially making one change at a time. And we call this minimal change benchmark, visual minimal change, abbreviated as VisMin. So here on the first category is object change. So on the left, we have a table with several dishes on it with a stereo. And on the right, we have a table with several dishes on it with a television, right? So we change the stereo to television. So we make these changes both on the caption front and on the image front. So basically, these two image caption pairs are now very similar to each other. There is only one change, which is a change of object from stereo to television. On the right, we have attribute change, where we are changing the color of the person's tie from black to green. And notice everything else remains the same. Nothing else changes, right? On the bottom left, we have a counting change, where we increase the number of counts of the basically toy cars from 1 to 3. And on the right, we have a spatial relation change, where we change the relative spatial positioning of the two objects by swapping the objects. So we designed this benchmark to have these 4 categories. And this was very cleverly chosen because it has been shown in the community that counting and spatial relations are kinds of skills that these models are not good at. And I will show later in the results that actually they are very good at object and attribute understanding, and counting and spatial relation, there's a lot of gap, there's a lot of headroom for improvement over there. So the most challenging part about this project was how to generate these hard negative images. It's as you can imagine, like swapping words in language is quite easy, but doing the same for images, image has a lot of structure, right? So you can't just take one object and crop it and put it at the other place. You have to make sure that it blends with the scene and all of that. So as you might be thinking, we're tapping on the capabilities of diffusion models, so strong image generative models we have, and we're using those models, but in a bit of a hand engineered way to be able to get these hard negative instances. So I am not going to go into details of exactly what is the pipeline for generating these images, but essentially at a high level, you cannot just take a diffusion model and ask it to, okay, here is an image containing a dog in the middle of the couch, change it to a doll in the middle of the couch. It doesn't often very work well, because what might happen is it might change the background, it might not faithfully generate dolls. So basically, the idea of making minimal change where you only change the dog to the doll and nothing else changes is actually quite difficult. So we had to use some sort of like a pipeline based method where we first segment the dog in the image and give that information to the diffusion model that only this thing you have to change and at this location, and the rest of the things you shouldn't change. So it's a bit of an involved pipeline. So, but overall, the main elements of this pipeline are given a caption, a dog is in the middle of the couch, and given an image. So these image caption compares come from an existing data set, COCO data set, and then we use an LLM to edit this caption. So we use an LLM to suggest object edits. So LLM suggests that, okay, dog can be changed to a doll, and this is an object edit. And then we basically use this pipeline with the diffusion model to go from the image, dog image to the doll image. So this is an example of object edit. We do attribute edits in the same way, but for counting and spatial relationship, the pipeline is a bit different. So here, what I'm showing is an example of a spatial relation edit. So the initial caption is a cup of coffee on the left and a plate of cookie on the right. And basically here, essentially what we want to do is swap the two objects. So if you see on the right, for the original image, the cup of coffee is plate of cookies to the right, right? So this is, I think, the original image, the bottom one, and the top one is what we obtain by this diffusion pipeline. So here, essentially, we use something called layout-based diffusion model, where we essentially first ask an LLM to generate. So in this case, actually, the original image is also generated. It's not a natural image. So the LLM generates a layout which basically says that, okay, on this canvas you should have coffee here, you should have cup here, and then we ask a diffusion model to generate an image corresponding to that. So that gives us the positive image, and then we take that positive image and basically manually swap the positions of the two crops and take the actual pixel values of the crop and feed it to a different diffusion model and ask it to generate the new image. So again, it's a bit of a hand engineered pipeline because it is very challenging to get these fine-grained, like minimal differences. So actually, if you notice, for this spatial relation category, we are not always, even after doing all this hand engineering, we're not like able to make sure that the change is minimal. As you see, the cup has changed a little bit, right? And the cookie plate also has changed a little bit. It's not exactly the same cookie plate. But we found that even though it is not a perfectly minimal change, this data is still helpful for improving the capabilities of the model. So yeah, overall, we have this pipeline, automated pipeline using diffusion models, using LLMs to go from existing image caption pair to hard negative, or what we call minimal change image caption pair. And then this, you can't just rely on this automated pipeline. You have to do some sort of check at the end to make sure you got what you wanted to get. So we have some sort of automated ways to check whether the target image that we got is consistent with the target caption and it is minimal change and all of that. So we use a visual question answering system to verify. So for example, if the target caption is a doll is in the middle of the couch, we verify whether there is a doll in this image or not, and whether the doll is in the middle of the couch or not. So actually, this automated filtering filters out 75% of the data. So that suggests that this original pipeline is not very accurate. It makes a lot of mistakes. So this way, we generate a large scale data set consisting of about 64,000 samples, consisting of these minimal change image caption pairs for 4 different types of controlled edits. But then we also wanted to have a very controlled benchmarking set that we can use just for model evaluation. And for that, we went through human verification. So we did a mechanical Turk study where we asked humans to verify a bunch of things, such as whether the image is looking natural or not, whether the caption is sounding natural or not, whether the image and caption are matching or not, whether the change is minimal or not. And that actually filters out additional 83% of the data. In spite of this automatic filtering, there are a lot of issues with the naturalness. I think the majority of the data is lost when humans filter out whether the images are natural or not, because a lot of times the images that are generated by these diffusion models might not look very natural. So because of this lot of filtering, we eventually then end up with only 2,000 examples, but this is okay because this is a benchmarking set. This is not for model training. So basically that with all this, we ended up creating a data set which has a large training set that we can use for fine tuning the models. And we have a benchmark set which is small, but it is very clean, verified by humans. And the main characteristic of our data is the visual complexity. Because we work with COCO images, which are very complex in nature, and we have minimal change edits on top of that. It's actually a very complex but controlled data, so it's quite interesting. And yeah, as I said, we have human approval for the benchmarking part. So these are some of the characteristics that make this data set stand out compared to some existing work. So there are some other works in the literature where people try to create this minimal change benchmark, but they don't have like a human verification, and they don't work with complex images like Coco. They usually work with more toyish images. So this is the first benchmark that is very complex in nature and is very clean also. This is the overall distribution of different categories. So on the left, you see the training distribution, where we don't try to make the categories uniform. Naturally, we have more object categories because there are more objects in COCO than there are attributes in COCO. On the right, we have the benchmark distribution, where we try to make it uniform across categories as much as possible, but we weren't able to control it perfectly because of all the filtering and stuff. So that is the data that we came up with. Now, what do we do with this data, right? So there are two use cases of this data. One is for the benchmarking purpose, and this is to evaluate how good models' visual understanding is, right? So in the previous piece of work that I talked about with two captions and one image, dog on the left, cat on the right, and stuff, we are still evaluating the model's ability to distinguish between two similar captions, right? We are not evaluating the model's ability to distinguish between two similar images, which could be more challenging task depending on how good model's visual understanding is. So this benchmark allows us to do that. We have two very similar images and two captions. Now you can evaluate the model all different in four different ways. So basically, you give two captions and one image at a time, and you ask which caption is the right caption. So this is similar to the previous evaluation. But you can also do this other way around evaluation, where you give two images and one caption and ask which image is the right match given the caption, right? So there are four ways you can evaluate the model, where the random chance in each case is 50%. But we compute a score which basically gives the credit to the model if all four classifications are correct. And that is for the discriminative models like CLIP, but we also evaluate generative models, which can actually generate language. So these are open source models like Lava, IDFX, which in terms of input and output, they work very similar to models like GPT-4 and Gemini. We also evaluate GPT-4 and Gemini, by the way. So here with the generative model, the way we evaluate them is basically we give them two captions and we ask which caption is a better match for the image, and the model generates a response saying caption 1, caption 2, or the other way around, where we give two images to the model and ask, given this caption, which image is a better match for the caption, and it gives image 1, image 2 as the response. So it's an open-ended free-form generation as a response. So then we can look at basically the benchmarking numbers. So when we evaluate a bunch of these models of the type of CLIP, which are just they cannot generate. It's a discriminative model versus models like GPT-4 Gemini, which are generative models. How well do they perform? So I'm going to highlight some high-level points here, but there are a lot more details in the paper. So one consistent pattern we noticed was object and attribute understanding. All the models do very good at this. So basically, it seems like the models we have built so far, they have become already quite good at object and attribute understanding. So maybe we don't need to focus that much on it, and we should focus more on other types of capabilities like relation understanding and counting, where the performance is not that great. Relation understanding is particularly the most challenging type of task in our benchmark. And we evaluated, as I said, also like GPT-4, Gemini, all these latest models. And here you can see even GPT-4 Turbo and Gemini, their performance is very low for relation understanding, right? So this is something that is really challenging for these even state-of-the-art models. We also basically, as I said, we also have a large scale fine tuning set. So what we wondered was if we fine tune the model on this data set, can it improve its performance both on our benchmark, which is sort of very similar to the training set, but also other benchmarks that evaluate for similar compositional understanding capabilities. And basically, we saw that actually our bench data set is quite useful. So basically, having these hard negative images and hard negative captions and fine tuning the model with that. We fine tune both the clip style models and also a generative model called IDFX2. And we see significant improvement on their understanding capabilities. There is just one case which I want to highlight where we don't see performance improvement is clip for spatial relation category. So it seems like maybe the clip architecture or objective function, I don't know what it is not really capable of making use of this spatial relationship data, and the performance just doesn't improve. But all the other categories and all the other models, we see improvements in the performance. So this was the improvement on the same benchmark, which is sort of like an IID setting. And these are improvements on other benchmarks. So this is out of distribution setting. And this finding these results suggest that we are not just overfitting to our data distribution, we are actually improving the compositional reasoning capabilities of these models. And finally, as I mentioned in the previous piece of work, you always have to make sure that you are not losing the fundamental capabilities of these models like CLIP. So here we evaluate CLIP on the image text retrieval task, which does not require this kind of compositional understanding. And we see that sorry, we see that the performance of the model actually improves even in that case. So basically, this suggests that the data, this hard negative data that we built here with minimal change differences is quite useful for actually boosting the capabilities of representation learning capabilities of these models. And yeah, this is the last bit. We saw that our data is more useful for bigger models than for smaller models. But we only have 2 data points here. I wish we had more data points here. But we have like an initial evidence of larger model has better gains from our training set. So overall, the conclusion from this piece of work is we built this new benchmark, which can be used for evaluating for compositional understanding or fine-grained understanding capabilities of these models. We have an automatic pipeline for generating such visual minimal change pairs. And benchmarking models on our benchmark suggest that VLMs, both discriminative and generative, are quite good at attribute and object understanding, but actually poor at counting and spatial relation understanding. So we need to improve those capabilities of these models as a community. And finally, fine tuning on our data helps improve these capabilities of the models, where we saw that almost everywhere we see improvement except improving spatial relation capabilities of CLIP. And that speaks a bit towards the architecture and the training function of CLIP. Whereas on the generative side, so if we are training on spatial relation data hard negative data that we have, we actually improve the performance of generative models quite a bit. So it seems like generative models have capability to digest this spatial relation minimal change data and learn spatial relation from that, but clip-like models struggle with that. And yeah, so here this, as I said, this work is still under submission at NeurIPS, but we have put together a project website here. So if you're interested in checking out the paper, you're welcome to do so. So I'm going to change gears now a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about how. Is there any comment, question?
No, that's fine. I thought
Okay.
I'm glad that you're talking on. I was afraid that it was ending. I want to point out to everybody that Aishwarya is struggling against a case of COVID. And our next speaker also has COVID more severely than Aishwarya, it seems.
Yeah, that is all the coughing because of COVID. Okay, all right. So yeah, so I talked about this compositional understanding challenge and how it is how existing VLMs struggle with this. Another challenge I want to talk about is robust automatic evaluation. So basically, I want to show two.
Ishmael, can I ask you to just lower your volume a little bit?
Okay, I will try. I actually struggle with doing that, but okay, I will try. So automatic evaluation.
You can do it on your computer, not necessarily your larynx.
I can I control the microphone reception level? I'm not sure I can. Yeah, so I will just try to control it physically. Okay, so automatic evaluation, I'm going to present two case studies here, one for evaluating the outputs of visual question answering model and one for evaluating the outputs of an image caption generation model, and talk about some recent work we have done in this space. So when it comes to evaluating the output of visual question answering model, where the input is an image, a question, and the output is an answer, and typically the answer is actually very brief. So when we proposed this task of VQA back in 2015, when we proposed the VQA dataset, we proposed a very simple evaluation metric, which is essentially simple answer accuracy. So we check whether the model generated answer matches the set of reference answers. So for each question, we collect 10 human answers and we check how many of the human answers does the model generated answer match. And because there are 10 human answers, there was actually quite a good agreement between humans. So this simple string matching based metric used to work quite well until very recently. So this is some example questions and answers from the VQA dataset that we created back in 2015, which is one of the most popular VQA datasets so far. So here we have this image, and the question is, what object is this? And then 10 different humans provided answers, and you see there is some variability in the human answer, but still there is quite a bit of an agreement. Unless the question is a bit vague, like how old is the TV, then you see more variability in human answers. But overall, in this data set, if you look at interhuman agreement rate, it is 83%. So there's a quite a high interhuman agreement rate. And so basically, because we have these 10 answers with quite high agreement, we can use this simple string matching based metric, and it used to work quite well. But recently, with the advances in the vision and language models, we basically saw that this string matching based metric is not working well anymore, because now the models are not working on in this IAD setting. So, like before, we used to train these models with training data, evaluate on the test data coming from the same distribution. So the models sort of adapt to the expected answers in the training, and they generate similar answers at test time. But now we have all these generative models, we are evaluating them in zero shot setting. So now the models may not necessarily adapt to the training distribution, right? So the generated answer might not match the expected human answer. So now we need better metrics to evaluate that. So here I'm showing you some examples of cases where the simple string matching based metric fails quite a bit. So for example, if you have a question like this, what are the sticks used for? And there are multiple possible answers: balancing, pushing, skating. So these are semantically different in nature, right? So here string matching fails for 34% of the time. If you have answers where there is a difference in the level of specificity of the answer, so where is the height went on the right versus right, so the string matching fails here as well. If you have synonyms, what is the setting of this picture? Is it field, plain, grassland? So yeah, synonyms to string matching would fail here. And similarly, other cases where sometimes you just have bad question or like a generic response. So in this work, which is published at AAAI this year, what we propose is essentially using an LLM-based evaluation, where we ask the LLM to basically rate a candidate answer, where the answer comes from a model, given the question and given the set of human reference answers, right? So note that we are not asking the model to evaluate the answer given the image and the question. That is actually quite challenging, and we don't want to rely on these models because in the first place, they're not very good at solving the task, right? So here it's a simpler task where we just ask it to do sort of like a semantic matching between the given answer and the set of reference answers given the question. And we compute correlation with human judgment. We see that it correlates much better compared to the string matching based metric, and also there are a bunch of these other soft metrics you can build based on some, like say, BERT embeddings and stuff. And the slave metric, which is LLM based metric, performs better than that also. So yeah, here showing some examples, but in the interest of time, I will skip on this and move forward. But basically, the idea is it is able to capture a lot of these failure modes of string matching based metric, but still it is not a perfect metric. But because, for example, let's say you cannot identify without looking at the image if a given answer is correct or not, because the given answer might be very different from the reference answer, but might still be correct answer. So those cases, this metric is just not capable of working well, right? Speaking about evaluation, so I talked about evaluating visual question answering models. So it's not so easy. So because we are evaluating language output, and language evaluation is not easy in the first place. But the hope was that with VQA, it's a very precise task. You have like one word answers, so it would be easy. But that also doesn't seem to be easy these days. The next case study is evaluating image caption generation models. So here you're given an input, and basically the model is generating a caption. So typically, or like traditionally, image caption evaluation used to rely on n-gram based matching between the candidate caption and a set of human written reference captions, right? So here you see like 5 reference captions, 4 reference captions, and a candidate caption. And basically, there are these metrics called blue, spice, etc., which basically check what is how many n-grams in the candidate caption match in the reference caption, and so on. And this has the problem of basically low recall. So there might be a lot of good captions that may not be captured because the reference caption does not have the same n-grams, right? So recently, some papers proposed reference-free evaluation, where basically what they're proposing is, how about we don't make use of references at all? We just ask a model like Clip to tell us whether this caption is the right caption for the given image or not. So we are essentially computing the similarity score between image and caption and using that as a evaluation. So this study that we did, led by my student Sabha, what we wanted to figure out is this actually a reliable metric? Because we are using a model like Clip to evaluate image captions. And if Clip doesn't understand captions in the first place, like how is it really a robust way of doing evaluation? And we do a bunch of analysis, and we essentially show that it actually fails quite a bit when it comes to when you give, let's say, 2 captions which are very similar to each other, but they have these fine-grained differences. So you can see like very weird failure modes of this clip-based evaluation. So for example, here, the correct caption is the title of the book is Topology, and the incorrect caption is title of the book is Muffin. But because there is a muffin in the image, it actually gives a higher score to the red caption, which is the incorrect caption, than to the correct caption, because it doesn't really, I guess, understand the meaning of the sentence. It is just going based on whether there is a muffin in the image or not. It has poor understanding of negation, so it just does not, if you insert a not in the sentence, it gives the same score, essentially. It is also biased, so for longer captions, it gives higher score than it gives to shorter captions. We also checked what is its bias in terms of, like, if it is biased in terms of the number and the size of objects mentioned in the caption. So if your caption talks about a smaller object, there is a knife, versus a caption talks about a bigger object in the image, there is a pizza, it has a tendency to give higher score to the bigger object than to the smaller object. It also doesn't pay attention to the sentence structure. So if you jumble up the words, there is a knife versus their knife is, the score doesn't change. So all of these is to say that, we shouldn't just blindly be using such reference-free model evaluations, because they have their own problems. So now I don't have a lot of time left, but I really want to tell you about this really cool project that we are just wrapping up. So in this project, what we want to evaluate is, are these existing vision and language models good at cultural understanding? And the motivation for doing this is because if you look at the popular pre-training data sets which are used to train these vision language models, they have Western-centric biases. So here I'm listing the names of some of the popular data sets, Coco, Leon, etc. And most of these have images and captions coming from Western part of the world. And there's actually this paper that quantifies, I think this quantification is for ImageNet and the COCO dataset. It looks at the distribution of countries within that dataset, and you see there's a heavy bias towards North America and Europe. So in this work, which is a collaboration between Siva Reddy, another professor here, Google collaborators, and my students, here what we evaluate is basically cultural understanding capabilities of these models. And now culture in itself is quite an interesting topic, right? Like, what do you mean by culture? What does evaluating cultural understanding entail? So here, roughly, you can classify it into two categories: visible cultural manifestations and invisible cultural manifestations. So visible elements of culture are examples like food, drink, clothing, rituals that you can see in an image, and you can basically ask questions about, what food this is, what clothing this is, and in order to be able to answer those questions, you need to have understanding about those cultural concepts. However, there are invisible cultural manifestations which pertain to like norms, values, and beliefs, which are not directly visible, but their manifestations are visible in images. So, for example, in for this leftmost image, people are bowing, and this is essentially reflects Japanese values that they respect their elders and they bow in front of their elders. The middle image is basically representing this norm in Korean weddings, where basically people pull the feet, or I think, pull the feet of the groom. And the last image is from Indian culture, where basically people fold hands, and that symbolizes their beliefs towards praying and God and all of that, right? So there are these invisible cultural elements, but you can probe about models' understanding of such elements by asking questions about images, right? So essentially, in this work, what we do is we build a repository of image and captions, and on top of that, we collect questions and answers to probe models' understanding about culture. So we start with this dataset that exists called CCSK dataset, which has a bunch of language-only assertions about culture. So, for example, it has this assertion says the most important festival celebrated in India is Diwali. So it has this cultural assertion in its dataset, and it has a bunch of these different cultural assertions. So we collect all those, and then we scrape images from internet, which basically the images come from the same web page associated with these assertions, and we use some heuristic based methods like clip to mine the relevant images corresponding to these assertions. So this process could be a bit noisy, but then when humans write questions, they can basically choose to ignore images if it is not relevant to the question. So we have some way to sort of filter it out. So with this, we create a repository of images and captions, where the captions talk about cultural concepts. So people in Brazil wear either black or purple to represent grief and loss. The festival features Nigerian voodoo spirit walking the street. Pav bhaji is an Indian fast food dish. The lion dance is an important tradition in Chinese culture. So we have these concepts about food, clothing, drink, rituals, and traditions across 10, 11 different countries. And we create this repository, and basically for model evaluation, what we are doing is collecting questions and answers from humans who are familiar with the cultural concept shown in the image to write challenging culturally probing questions. So we actually have to reach out to annotators who are familiar with these cultural concepts, right, which is actually quite a tricky task. So we basically, the prompt we give to them is, your task is to ask a question about cultural concept depicted in the image that someone from your culture will be able to answer easily, but someone who is not familiar with your culture will not be able to answer. And the motivation for such a prompt was to elicit challenging questions from humans. And we also give them a bunch of criteria that your question should require looking at the image, it should elicit a single correct answer, it should not be based on stereotypes, it should not be based should be based on cultural facts, and so on. And then we have to also guide them when they are writing answers. So we want them to write culturally precise answer. So we don't want them to give generic answers. So let's say there's an image of Christmas, and the question is what event this is. They shouldn't say holiday. They should say precisely it is Christmas. And there's always a risk that they might tend to write answers in local languages. So in this project, we are not actually focusing on multilingual cultural understanding. We're only focusing on English. So we have to make sure that they do not start writing answers in local languages. So this is an example of like Indian data collection, and they started writing answer in Hindi. And we had to guide them that you should not write your answer in local language unless there is a direct English translation does not exist. So for example, naan is actually well accepted word even in English, and we actually use this heuristic whether the Wikipedia link exists or not to identify whether this is a local word or this is an acceptable word to be used in English. Because we want them to also write culturally specific answers. We don't want them to write very generic answers. So yeah, there are lots of nuances around how to evaluate this kind of task. So here, for example, what food item is shown in the image, and if they write Indian bread, we don't consider that as an acceptable response. We want them to write a culturally specific response, which will be none. Whereas on the right, if the question is what is the green substance in the image, we don't want them to write the Hindi translation for this, for the coriander leaves, because there is no need for that. They can just say coriander leaves and it would be perfectly acceptable. So there is a lot of actually, we had to go through a lot of challenges in sourcing such data from, because the biggest challenge was we have to get annotators from different parts of the world. So we have data from Africa, we have data from Brazil, from China. So we actually couldn't stick to basically crowdsourcing platforms like MTurk. We had to source our data from different sources, including asking students to from different like universities in the Montreal to write questions for us. And people who are maybe from non-English speaking countries, they had sometimes hard time adhering to the instructions in the prompt. So we had to like provide tutorials to them and work with them to be able to get good quality data. And overall, we have data from these many countries. The data collection is still ongoing. And here are some example questions that we obtained. So the first question is from Turkey. What does the bride-to-be add to the groom-to-be's drink in the image when he asks for her family's blessing to marry? So this is actually a tradition in Turkey to add a little bit of salt in the coffee when basically the groom is asking for like bride's family's permission to marry her. So these questions expose cultural understanding, okay, will like require cultural understanding about these cultures, right? On the right, we have Indian example, what is around the bride and groom's neck. So you could say it is a floral garland, but that is not very culturally specific response. So we want the response to be Varmala, which is actually the precise word used to refer to this garland. Similarly, we have an example from Canada, we have an example from Nigeria. So overall, this is actually, these statistics are based on some pilot data that we collected last week, but now we have more data. So overall, we have about 150 questions also for like 10 or 11 countries. So yeah, we have, I think, total around 2,000 questions so far. And there's a lot of diversity in the answers. Unlike typical traditional VQ data sets where the answers are, there are a lot of repeating answers like colors, numbers, etc. Here, each answer is actually unique. So the number of unique answers is almost very close to the number of unique questions we have. And on the right, you see what are the different facets we have. So we have drink, clothing, rituals, food, traditions, etc. And this is a distribution of question types. So a lot of the questions are actually what, but basically these are very different kind of what questions. So the answers are very different from each other. Another challenge that comes to open-ended VQA task is how do you evaluate the model output, right? So we fall back to this metric that I proposed earlier, that I talked about earlier, where we use LLM-based evaluation, where the LLM is basically checking the accuracy of the model generated answer with respect to some given reference answers. So for example, if we, in this case, the ground truth answer is praying or religious offering, and the model says prayer time. So string matching wouldn't be able to get it right, but LLM-based evaluation can basically take care of the variability in the syntax as long as semantically it is correct. Similarly here, prasadam versus prasad, it means the same thing, just it's not the exact same string, right? So the next thing is obvious question is, okay, where do our vision and language models stand? Is this data set challenging enough for these models? And the answer here is actually yes and no. So we evaluated a bunch of models, including these closed source models like Gemini GPT-4 and a very state-of-the-art open source models as well. And here I'm showing you performance breakdown based on different continents. So what we see is for North America, the performance is actually quite high, above 80% for both open and closed source models. But as you go to other regions, especially like Africa, the performance actually goes down quite a bit. And so does the gap between the open source and closed source models, right? So the open source models are sort of catching up to the closed source models for North America, but as you go beyond North America, the gap starts increasing, which speaks to the quality of data they are being trained on, right? And yeah, closed source models are generally better than open source models. Here, you're looking at performance breakdown across some of these countries for some open and closed source models. So GPT-4 outperforms all the models, with Gemini being the second best. It's sort of, you might not be surprised with this. Whereas on the open source side, there is this model called InternVL, which is the best performing open source model. And it is probably because it is trained with larger and more data. Here are some examples of GPT-4 failure cases. So I can only understand the first one because that is from Indian culture. So the question is, what type of Indian bread is this in the picture? And the prediction is this word called khakra, which actually is a completely different item. But if you squint your eyes, it looks visually, it looks a little bit similar to the actual answer here, which is type of bread, naan. So there are basically, when you look at where these models fail, it's not like they don't have any cultural understanding. They do have cultural understanding, but when you basically probe them about very specific concepts, then yeah, they are not very precise in their cultural understanding. So overall, to conclude, in this work, we collected a large repository of culturally relevant image text pairs. We proposed cultural VQA, which is a new task to evaluate VLM's cultural understanding. We did comprehensive evaluation of both open and closed source models, and we see some interesting findings. And with that, I would like to wrap up my talk. So I talked about what are some outstanding challenges in vision and language research. So compositional reasoning is one, but we saw that with fine tuning, with high quality curated hard negative data, you can improve the compositional understanding capabilities of these models. For we also saw that robust automatic evaluation is actually not easy when you are generating language condition on images. So we saw for VQA, you can use this LLM based evaluation to check the accuracy of candidate answer with respect to reference answers. And for image captioning, we saw that reference free evaluation has been proposed, but one needs to be careful with that because the metric is not very robust. And finally, we looked into cultural and geo-diverse understanding. So basically now that these VLMs are getting better and better in traditional scene understanding problems, the time is ripe to go and test them on more challenging problems like cultural understanding. And as I said, evaluating cultural understanding is not very easy because there are a lot of nuances here, and also collecting data is not very easy. But with the data we got so far, we see that VLMs have decent cultural understanding for North America, but they perform poorly for Africa and Asia. And with that, thanks for your patience and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Your discussant is, of course, Ellie. I just wanted to ask you, who are the collaborators in the cultural studies? Just computer scientists?
Yeah, so we actually have a postdoc who is working on this project. I think she has socioeconomic, I don't remember the exact name of her discipline, but she is not traditional computer scientist. So yeah, she is the farthest one from all of us, but others are computer scientists.
Modest suggestion, you might have cross-cultural psychologists and psychologists collaborate for the design of the study.
Yeah, I think this is something actually we considered, but for this piece of the effort, we were sort of in rush to put it together and put it out for the conference. But this is actually a long-term research agenda for me, and I'm definitely planning to collaborate with people outside the CS discipline.
Ellie, take over.
All right. Actually I put together some slides. I don't know how much I want to use them because I want to, but can I share for a sec? So I think you need to stop sharing, Ashma.
Yeah, let me do that.
Exactly. Yeah, awesome talk. Really interesting stuff. So I wanted to focus on like kind of probe a question, which is which you probably have thoughts on. So like you have a lot of these very cool methods, like clever ways of generating the negatives and setting up the training and things that I'm like the compositionality is particularly close to home. I'm really interested in that problem. But like you kind of have like these clever ways of getting them VLM models to learn these more nuanced, more intricate models of the world and of language. And then my question kind of in context of all the other talks over the past 2 weeks and today is like, why do we need to do this, right? So there's kind of this feeling in the language side of things. And I think like we were talking about earlier is like the argument that like, oh, we have this self-supervised generative learning and like somehow from that we're getting like an amazing amount of stuff, right? And then somehow in the vision and language models, it's like seems harder. And when I've talked to colleagues working in vision, I used to be like, language is the hardest thing. Like every animal can see, only some animals have language, right? So language is the hard thing. And like now I look at the state of AI and I'm like language has taken off in the past year and like vision hasn't seen an analogous like breakthrough. And I'm trying to I like want to hear your thoughts on like why this might be what is fundamentally different. So I was going to throw out like 2 observations that have come up a lot in my group and in our work on thinking about this that I want to your take, and then kind of like one hot take I have that is like not based on much, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but that's kind of related to things. So one of the observations is that the vision language interaction is just very superficial. Like I think kind of in the talks earlier today, and like there's just kind of this dream of like, oh, we're going to pump all of this, like we have language right now and that's not grounded and it's not that intelligent, but once we extend it to experience and multimodality and stuff, we'll just like get all the other stuff because we have this recipe that works. But when we do stuff like that, and granted clip isn't like clip, it has its issues or something, but when we have these multimodal models and you just kind of throw everything in, and even in like the kind of natively multimodal models and stuff, you don't see like super rich evidence of anything profound going on. It kind of just seems like you have a language model and a vision model and they get stitched together. Like we tried to do a study, and this is a pretty simple one where we like trained a version of, this was VideoBERT, this a couple years ago, so things aren't that great, but it was like a controlled study where we had the model with vision and without vision, and we were like looking at all these different tasks to be like, do we get anything from adding in the vision? And like the answer was no. And of course this study might not have been perfect, but it was still like we should have felt like we saw something we didn't. And there was another paper that I liked, I think a couple years ago, that was showing that basically you learn these 2 subspaces, like the text space and the image space, right? And they're not that entangled. And maybe the cognitive neuroscientists in the room can chime in and say like, well, they're not that entangled in humans either, but somehow I feel like we all share this intuition that somehow they should be more entangled, and the language should help the vision and the vision should help the language. And I feel like we're not seeing that. So that was kind of one observation that I was curious to hear your thoughts on. And the second one that's bothered me a lot from our own work is like this feeling that when you have vision and language models, it's like the language that's doing the heavy lifting, because I've made the argument myself that has been made throughout, which like we need the grounding, right? Like you need the reference, you need the physical experience, you need these things to really get meaning. And yet, like when you look at various projects, it feels like the language is doing most of it and the vision's kind of like along for the ride. And so like the study we had done was this one where you like take an image and you just learn a linear projection from the image into like the token space of the language model, and then use that as an image captioner, right? And we actually got very good image captions where it seemed to be as good as having trained a multimodal model in these various cases. And sometimes I kind of use this as an example of like language models have a good grounded representation. But my real feeling is that actually what we're dealing with is like a coarse-grained topic cue that we get from the image. Like it knows it just has to roughly be like, there's water. And then a really good prior you get from a language model that's very good at inferring what's probably happening if you have water, right? So it's like you can get really far. And I know you've done a lot of really good work on like how gameable the VQA benchmarks are. And I feel like that's what we're basically seeing is like you get a little bit from the image and a lot from the language model. And that's also deeply unsatisfying because you're like, but where is this like big connectionist model that slurps in all the data and learns this rich, like experiential grounded language, right? Because instead it feels like we're mostly text is doing the heavy lifting. So those are kind of two observations where I'm like I want to see like basically why is this happening? Why is vision so hard, and why can't we language people go to vision and be like, help us learn better language? Like why is that like reality not being realized? And I wonder if you had insights. I had a hot take, but I actually feel like I don't want to give that one. I more wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks for putting together all the thoughts and asking interesting questions. I think I just have one thought actually, which basically feels like my answer to all of the questions you were asking. And the answer lies in the nature of these two modalities, right? The vision modality is actually quite different from the language modality. Language is discrete, abstract in nature. Each word has a semantic meaning, whereas a cluster of pixels on images do not carry as much meaning, right? Vision is very perceptual in nature. It is there is no discrete boundaries. Like for example, how do models even figure out what an object corresponds to? And I think this is something Alyosha talked about the other day as well. We don't. We are when we train these models, image classification. So a lot of this visual representation is being learned by models. We are training visual representation learning capabilities through tasks like image classification. Like that used to be the de facto visual encoder training task, right? Only recently we have made the switch where we are now training the models like end to end with language generation. But even there, like it's not like the vision models we have are actually, although they are able to generate this label that there's a cat, dog, etc., they are doing it just based on some low level image statistics. They are not doing it based on actually like understanding that there is this object, right? And there is this whole line of work on object centric representation learning, which I'm actually quite interested, and we are planning to start a project in that as well. But so based on my little understanding of that line of work, it essentially sounds like it's quite hard to learn object-centric representations, especially when it comes to complex images. Like those kinds of models work very well with toy images, like Clever, kind of, if you know about the Clever data set, those kinds of images. So I feel like yeah, this is like again my limited understanding, but I feel like it's really has to it has to do something with that difference in the nature of these modalities, right? So for example, if let's say we had a way we have these scene graph style models, right, where you take an image and they would give you a scene graph out of it, where they will mark all the objects and all the like the relations between objects. And that when you have that level of representation from an image, then that is very similar to like a language representation, right? Like then you can essentially do all sorts of like basically any task that we do with language, purely language, right? But right now we don't have that. And even as you said, like even with these large multimodal generative models, essentially we are basically encoding the images, and then there is essentially always something called like a mapping network, which basically takes all these vision features and maps it to the embedding space of the LLM, right? But that is a bottleneck, right? Like definitely that mapping network, and in fact, like I myself have done a work where we're trying to make that mapping network very parameter efficient, but the more parameter efficient it is, the more bottleneck it is, right? So there is ideally what we want is some sort of like very dense interaction between the vision encoder and the language encoder. And people have done so. Aaron Goodwill, who is a professor here at Mila, he did work like 5-10 years ago, and this paper is called Film, where back in the CNN days we are using language to guide batch norm parameters of the model, right? So we need this interaction between language and vision very, very early on, and not as sort of like a post-processing. And I think maybe a lot of this feeling that we see and the observation that we see is, that's it's superficial. The interaction is quite superficial, is probably coming because of the way we are designing models. Yeah. Yeah, I guess.
I'm glad you think that, because I think that's similar to kind of what my hot take was. I would love to hear from the cognitive scientists in the group about like how superficial or not it is, we think it is in humans or something. I sometimes, there's some work that kind of differentiates between like the perceptual and the cognitive, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, perception is just this kind of low level, some edge detection, some foreground background separation, blah blah blah, and then you quickly get into the cognitive domain, and that's where the reasoning happens, and that might as well be a language model. So maybe it should be superficial, but I don't know.
Friedemann is poised to answer.
Oh, okay.
Friedemann, turn on your microphone.
And what answer to what question?
Well, the question is, is it realistic to do these studies on vision, which is static image identification and description, from the point of view of the organization of language and vision in the brain?
Well, if one wants to focus on the relationship between language and vision, one could try to find, one could view vision as a more complex task. For example, attributing predicate, predication relationships to what we see. For example, the man is sitting on the horse or something, that they are not just X is to the left and Y is to the right, but how the items are related to each other, and then the relationship between so there could be something like a subject predicate structure to be interpreted into the world, into the visual picture, into the visual images, which is sometimes more intuitive and sometimes less, especially if actions are in focus. Then that's quite obvious that you would say he plays the drums or something, and not the drums do something or so. So the structure of the picture could be, apart from the over and above the perceptual aspects, could be more closely seen as more closely related to language than it may appear on first view, and for the vision scientists themselves. And as further point is, if we think of language picture relationships, we typically think of naming objects or describing pictures, like the cat is to the left and the dog to the right. But in everyday life, language use, it's very different. You may have for example, in a request communication, you go to a traditional shop, ask the shopkeeper to give you God knows what, a lighter and a newspaper, and then there's the visual surrounding acts as a reference space and as an inspiration for the language game, and that's also something that to model this is perhaps more challenging than just to have a one-to-one relationships between and well, these are just some thoughts, but
sorry to coerce you.
Sorry?
I'm sorry to have coerced you.
No, I'm really not a specialist in these things.
Yeah, let me say something that you won't disagree with. You're looking for some direct connection between vision and vision of static images and language. That's certainly not the way grounding works. The first relation you want is between what you see and what you do with what you see. Or not even what you do with it. It can be even be what you do around it. There's the famous Held-and-Hine experiment of the kittens that are linked together, that are yoked together, and horrible things. I won't say what they did to the kittens, but if they're deprived of the chance to see, they become functionally blind if they're prevented from seeing. But even if you let them see, they still remain blind. But if you put them into a patterned cylinder, two kittens, one walking, and the other one a passive passenger being brought around by the one who's walking. The one who walks learns to see, the one who just watches passively doesn't. So it's the interaction between what you do and what you see, and by what you do doesn't mean what you say. It means what you do. Okay, there are other questions over here. In fact, I'm going to take an unusual question from the hall here. Denise Goulet.
Hello, everyone. I'm Denise, the executive assistant at IAC UCAM. Thank you for this great and super presentation. It was very, very interesting. I just have a comment. I saw on the slide when you show Canada and the flags, and you said on Remembrance Day, you said it was a tulip flower, but on this day, it's rather a poppy instead of a tulip. Tulip are growing in spring. And it's only, that was my comment. So it was it's a nice flower, red flower with 4 petals for Remembrance Day. Thank you again, and get well soon. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the comment.
Jan, you're on. Jan Hookinen, you're on. Turn on your.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I was intrigued by the compositionality and relations question. Like, just a simple question. Why couldn't we just montage images of individual objects and create kind of infinite amounts of compositionality and relations? And maybe second half of the question would be that can you kind of list what types of relations, or like the names or types of relations and compositionality structures it would be nice to have, so to kind of get kind of concrete understanding about the problem? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. For the suggestion that you had, why can't we just create like I guess maybe synthetically generate, or maybe just like use like some sort of like a the engine to generate a bunch of these images, maybe. So there are actually data sets that do that. Clever is an example of a data set where they have this engine to generate images, where you have like toy shapes like cubes, sphere, cylinder, and you can then, you have the full control. You can have them in all different combinations and different colors, and so many different combinations. So I think I have two things to say over there. One is in computer vision, we have observed that when you train models with such data, which has some sort of regularity in it, right? Because it is being generated, it's not natural data. It does not have all the statistics of the images are not the same as those of the natural images. When you train models on this kind of data, it actually does not. It has very hard time generalizing to the real world data distribution. So I think it's a very reasonable to think that these kinds of capabilities, especially like spatial reasoning and counting, like you can of course generate a lot of what we call synthetic data for that and train models. But I think people have seen evidence that this is not scalable, in that it does not generalize well to the natural world distribution. So that there is that disconnect. And now so that was actually motivation for us, where we wanted to have these minimal changes on top of complex images, like the Coco example I talked about, because we wanted to really make these models work for these complex images. But the thing is, with these such images, it is not possible to generate all possible, like it's not as easy to generate all possible combinations, right? And I think to answer your second question, can we list down the specific relationships or the specific compositionality relationships? I cannot. I feel like there are so many different combinations here, right? Like if you just talk about object and attribute binding, for example, right? So when you have a single object, that can take multiple attributes. When you have two objects, then there are even more combinations of objects attributes, and you have like then you add more relationships on top, right? Spatial relationship, counting. I didn't even talk about actions because these models are actually even bad for action understanding. So I'm not sure if I understood your question, like how can we list down all possible relationships, and even if we can list down all possible interactions between, let's say, objects, we cannot generate data for all of that, especially if you're talking about natural data, right? So basically, I think the hope here is the model should be able to generalize from some instances. It should not need to see all those instances, right? Because I think we as humans don't see all those instances, but maybe it has to do a little bit with the interaction that we were talking about earlier. Humans do learn by interacting with objects around them. So maybe they have this other this other sensory input, which is this interaction. So they can maybe that makes it easier for them to understand like the boundaries between objects and understand the compositional relationships. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any further questions? Steve had his hands up before and now they're gone. Are you there still, Steve?
Yes, I'm here. Can you turn on my video, please?
It's always you, Steve. It's not me.
No, Stephen, it's always you.
Okay,
I'll
well,
explain this to you later if you like, but you have control of the video. But I will again become the booming voice from the ceiling. It's okay. So there's a lot. I mean, actually, that was a wonderful, kind of tour of all of the beautiful technology that's being developed out there and how this is transforming a lot of the way we understand categorization, which in psychology, Steve. Thank you. I'm back. I'm embodied again. This is good. So, I feel what's lurking in there is some actual resolution of some ancient lurking psychological theory that never ever got resolved, but somehow it's being resolved in this new connectionism and all of these wonderful modeling approaches. If you go back a little bit, and actually I'll talk a little about Stephen, who has this old theory of categorical perception in this, so he'll appreciate that, which goes back to two guys. Sorry about that, but Tversky and Roger Shepard. And you probably heard of them and you probably know all about them, but maybe not. And so they had two opposing theories. One of them was in a multidimensional space context where you were modeling features essentially. And in some sense, that's what's happening in terms of like the early CNNs and the kind of vision models that existed there. Tversky had a diagnostic model where he looked at structure that was both common and distinctive. And he created basically a simple kind of diagnostic formula to apply to lots of problems. They tended to work not in visual problems, but in language problems. This distinction is very important, I think, in the present context. It's also, I think I agree with Stephen, there's a sense in which there's something about grounding here. So if we had spent more time in the recent past on videos, on actual people doing things together and trying to figure out what they're doing. Now, Ellie may be right. Maybe an LLM will do all the work for you there, but I doubt it. I think you can create fairly ambiguous, complex situation that have all kinds of geopolitical, cultural problems in terms of the way people are doing things somewhere. And it would be interesting if a lot of the effort going towards classification, because it would go towards this kind of action video kind of modeling. In psychology, this is called event perception. And what you find is people naturally begin to parse information in a very regular way, and people have individual kinds of parsing rates. Some people parse things very fast, some people parse things very slow. Generally, those two people shouldn't get married because they will disagree about everything. So that's a bad thing. But on the other hand, what you can find is that if you have them parse this video and they parse the next video, and you line it up across the individuals, you'll find a straight line where every individual has some parsing rate in this set, and you can do it pairwise for all the videos you want. And what you find is at the event boundaries, there's a change in memory. They all of a sudden, if you ask them, they'll recall anything around the event boundary, but nothing else. They'll have forgotten everything else. So there's something interesting about this in that an LLM or some kind of categorization approach would have to parse it. And there's also something that comes up. It's the thing that not many people talk about: time. Time is going to be critical here, is how you get temporal structure in this thing. And so I'm just saying, I think a lot of psychologists would be shocked and surprised if they could follow this. Sadly, I don't think a lot of us can. So that means that it's hard to understand the experimental sort of importance of the outcomes and how they apply back to these things that are 100 years old that have yet to be resolved. And
Okay,
so,
we've run out of time now. We've passed.
thank you, Stephen. Oh, and
the event boundary.
categorical perception is important in this.
Yes, okay. The next speaker will be Tom Griffiths, and I'm going to tune in a little bit earlier because I don't know how handicapped he is. Stop, Tom, if you're already listening to this. Stay on when we cut this off, connect again, and we can make some accommodations for your state. Otherwise, thank you very much, and some more invisible applause for you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks everyone for the great discussion. Thanks, Ellie, for moderating this.